Welcome back. Last time we started about here, sorted some tyres and painted some lettering, bought the wrong brake discs and ended up around here. It feels like it's been a long time. It's been a long time. It's a pretty safe assumption to cast that I've been sat on my arse for the last 5 months, but that's not actually the case. I've built a bar with my daughters, decorated that bar, then of course drank beer at that bar. But there's also been a lot of K100 work. The fully modded frame came back from the powder coaters, and shortly after that the Retro Ride's seat platform. It was good to see the tank line matching nicely with the seat line. It's starting to take shape now, but I was still at a loss for what to do with the rear fairing. I had planned to design and make one, but as the time went by I was drawn more towards the matching Retro Ride's rear fairing, so I decided to order it. When it appeared I was a bit miffed, and it appeared to have lumps and bumps of weld all over the main surface. I ground these off gently and took it to the powder coater, who said he'd smooth it out a bit before coating it. It came back a few weeks later looking good. Now to decide what I can fit inside it. It's quite tight, so probably a rear light is as much as it'll take. Work continued in earnest on the gearbox and engine, stripping paint and cleaning everything. I started with Nitromors and then found Power Strip, a much stronger compound. It was very hard going, and I rinsed hour after hour trying to get rid of all of the grime. I was getting through a huge amount of brake cleaner, but it's magic stuff. To get into some of the tighter spots, I had a cheap Dremel copy from China. Cheap as it was, it did an amazing job of getting into the many thousands of nooks and crannies on the block. So there I was, day after day, stripping, cleaning, stripping, moving on, cleaning, and then cleaning some more. I used wire brush attachments on my drill, wire wool, nano sponges and kitchen brushes, but the grime kept on coming. 30 years worth of filth. I began to realise that no matter how much I did, it was never going to be as clean as I wanted it to be. So I decided on a new plan. I managed to locate a soda blaster about 15 miles away from me. I gave him a call and arranged to drop the block over. The price agreed was £100 for the gearbox and engine block. This was more than I wanted to spend at this point. But how much was my time worth? Hour after hour scrubbing, knowing that it was never going to be good enough. The block came back a few weeks later, and while it was definitely clean, it certainly wasn't perfect. The blaster had removed some of my manifold covers, and everything was covered in a thick crust of salt. So now I was in the weird predicament of having to clean up after it had been cleaned, and it really wasn't easy. I jet washed it outside, being careful not to get too close to any of the intakes. But every time it dried out, a fine layer of salt still remained on the surface. In the end, I resorted to scrubbing it with a kitchen brush and detergent. After this, I rinsed it once more with a jet wash, and finally it was clean. After this, I went over the entire block again with acetone. Surely it would be ready now. Well, it wasn't, but we'll save that story for later. Next up, it was time to tackle the alternator and starter motor. As the starter was working pretty well, I decided not to mess with it, and decided just to repaint it. The alternator, on the other hand, was looking pretty grimy, so I opted to give it a full strip down. After watching other people do the same, I was prepared for a proper ordeal, and it didn't disappoint. I didn't have a vice or any way to immobilise it, so gaining any kind of traction was proving very difficult. All the time I was doing this, I was carrying a bizarre injury on one of my fingers, called a mallet injury, caused when the tendon from the top of the finger snaps away from the bone. This meant I had to wear a splint for months, making this kind of work even more difficult. I wouldn't have minded so much if it had been some kind of like butch injury, but I'd sustained this injury taking off a pair of run tights. During this process, I can't state how important it is to keep all of the components together, all bagged and labelled. The last thing I need at this point is missing parts. As has often happened with this project, it came down to twatting it with a hammer. Sometimes it's difficult to know how far to go and at what point you stop taking things to bits and cleaning every last washer and nut. Even if nobody is ever going to see this, there's always a bit of you that wants it to be ultra clean and tidy nonetheless. I had to use a 3-legged puller to separate some of the parts. With the alternator apart, it was time to start blasting some of the components. The starter got the same treatment. Pretty soon, all of these bits were ready to be cleaned and prepped for painting. I started off with an aluminium cleaner, which turned out to be ultra noxious and ruined my sideboard and drainer, much to the displeasure of my wife. On the upside, the parts were looking really nice and clean, so I put them in the oven to dry them out. I was wary about putting the starter in the oven, even at a low heat, so instead I used a hairdryer. When everything was finished, I wrapped it in industrial cling film and put it aside for painting. I managed to buy a nifty little fishing tent so as to minimise the paint splatter all over the garage. I got to work. My first rattle can job ever. In between coats, I started to work on the internal alternator parts. Lots of brake cleaner and scrubbing later, they turned out pretty well. The alternator was a big challenge to disassemble, and I can only hope I get it all right when I reassemble it. Back in the fishing tent, 3 coats later, and I was ready to start putting things back together. I finished them off with some genuine reproduction stickers from Heritage Stickers. You can find these guys on Instagram. I can't wait to get these fitted into the finished black block. Onwards. I got a second-hand pair of year-matching GSXR brake calipers. I was initially tempted to leave them be, but they did look a bit tired, and calipers are always an aesthetic focal point on a build, so I knew what I had to do. I was very careful to tape up as much as I could, and when it comes to reassembly, I'm going to get some assistance to make sure that everything is A1. I'm taking no chances with brakes. I carefully scalpeled around the taping before moving it to the blast cabinet. Next up, I managed to get some 70mm badges from Etsy at a good price, but I wanted to change the traditional emblem colour scheme to match my build. Here, I employed my trusty assistant to get on with transforming them, with help from some eBay stickers. She did a pretty good job, but let's keep that quiet, she'll want a pay rise. I prepped the rear hub with adhesion promoter and then added 4 coats of paint. Nice. So, remember when I said the engine block wasn't ready, even now? Exhaust studs. One had come out when I removed the exhaust, but the others were still in. I did battle with stud extractors, but on the studs close to the main body it was impossible to get in there with sockets. 2 more were extracted with the twin bolt method, but in the end 2 sheared and it was time to call my bolt whisperer. Again. Finally, all 8 bolts were out, and where necessary, sockets retapped. What a nightmare. Again. I couldn't paint the gearbox attached to the block because the top hat kept leaking when it was turned on its head. I detached it and prepped it for painting. As with the block, I'm using Eastwood 2K ceramic paint, which has a neat 2-part activated system, but in a rattle can. It was brilliant, but you only have a short window of 48 hours when it's activated before it sets solid in the can. I wasn't really feeling the cable tie and string fittings I'd cobbled together, so I had a think and remembered I had some threaded bar lying around that I could use to minimise the shadowing. 3 coats in and I was really liking the look. It also dried super hard, so we'll see how it fares in the real world. The final drive then got the same treatment. We were edging ever closer to painting the block. Time to tape and cling film everything and blast out any last minute squatters. A last clean down with acetone and we are nearly ready to lift it onto its nose. I'm hoping this is a turning point in the build. Once the block is painted, I can start reassembling everything and finally get it back to looking like a bike. This has been mammoth, so I'll get to the cost breakdowns and shout outs in the next one. After all the prep, I'm really hoping I don't screw up this block painting. Here we go. I'll see you next time.